Hard courses are just hard. And honestly, that's just because some things are harder to learn than other things. That's just the way it is. But you are about to learn 10 tips to help make hard courses less painful and easier to succeed in. Now, everyone's idea of what counts as a hard class is different. I'm not suggesting that all high school students should be taking AP Physics or that all college students should be taking organic chemistry. I took neither of those courses and I turned out okay-ish. No, instead, I'm talking about courses that feel hard to you based on your own personal skill level, strengths, and interests. Now, my 10 tips for taking hard courses that you're gonna learn in just a sec will apply and be helpful for you if you think a course is hard, regardless of its actual difficulty level on the transcript, okay? It's how you feel about a course. Hi, I'm Katie Azevedo of SchoolHabits.com. I'm a private executive function coach who teaches students and professionals strategies to learn and work smarter, which of course is the name of my podcast, Learn and Work Smarter, so you can find me over there. Also on Instagram at SchoolHabits and SchoolHabits.com. I think I covered it all. Please give this video a like and hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. And a transcript of this video is linked in the description box, as well as links to whatever else I happen to mention in this video. Now, to get started, I've created a sort of mental checklist for you to use to help you determine whether or not a course is hard, okay? Typically, you can just go by what it feels like, but if you're like, I don't even know if that counts, then use this checklist. You could consider a course hard if 1, you need to hear the material explained multiple times to understand it. 2, the teacher's explanations of the material aren't sufficient and you need to reinforce most concepts with YouTube or Google. Number 3, you have to meet with the teacher more than once a week to go over the material. Number 4, despite your honest best efforts, your grade is a C or lower. And number 5, you spend twice as long on a particular course than you do in your other courses for the same amount of work. Now, you might need to use all 10 tips that I share in this video, or you might just wanna listen through them all and then pick and choose and try out a couple. That would depend on you and the difficulty level of the course. All right, tip 1, stay exceptionally organized. All classes become monumentally harder if you're disorganized. From the very day that the class begins, you need to commit to a system to keep your files, your papers, your notes, and your deadlines on point. Think about it. If you can't find your notes and you don't know how to take notes and you lost your files and you don't know where you downloaded the whatever, of course a hard class is going to become harder. Even a class that wasn't even hard to begin with will become that much harder if you're not organized. In the description box below, I'm going to leave a link to a post that I have. It's 100 organization tips for students. Tip number 2 for hard classes is to prepare for class. Thanks to a really cool phenomenon called priming, we have a much easier time understanding new material if we've been exposed to it prior. And that's why preparing for a class is a critical tip for surviving hard courses. So here are 2 strategies to help you prepare for a class. Number 1, you want to look at the syllabus to find out what you're going to be covering in class, and then spend 10 to 20 minutes skimming that reading that goes along with the material. Yes, even if it hasn't been assigned yet, this is sometimes what it takes. Hard classes take different strategies. That's what it is. Number 2, you can spend 10 minutes reviewing your notes from the previous class or from your latest homework. Both of these are great priming strategies. Yeah, I know. You're probably thinking, oh my gosh, I do not have time to prepare for a class for this. I'm like, oh, just do 10 to 20 minutes of review. I know some of you are thinking, I don't have 10 to 20 minutes for all these classes. First of all, it's not for all of your classes. It's for your particularly hard classes. And then also, hear me out, the more you prepare for your class, a hard class, by using priming, the more you're gonna understand the material as you're being taught it during that class. Which means the less time that you'll spend agonizing over your homework assignments and the less time that you'll have to spend studying because you actually understood it when it was being taught to you, right? And then what does that do? Well, that makes the class actually no longer a hard class, right? Priming makes you understand the material better, and if you understand the material better, it means it's not so much of a hard class anymore. Tip number 3, spot the gaps and the fuzzies. Now, a key to taking and succeeding in hard courses is to be able to identify the moment that things start to fall apart, the moment that something becomes unclear or when the confusion hits. If you don't pause to identify when things become confusing, then everything is going to become confusing instead of that like one little thing that you got hung up on. So here are 3 tips for spotting the gaps and the fuzzies. Number 1, when you're reading challenging text, stop when you zone out. Go back and reread the point that you lost focus on. Google things if you need to. This is actually called metacognition, and it's the ability to think about thinking and to say, oh my gosh, I just zoned out. Number 2, so when you're in class and the teacher says something confusing, I want you to raise your hand and ask for clarification. Yep, you can do that. Number 3, if you're taking notes on a lecture or on a reading and it becomes confusing, put a question mark in your notes when something doesn't make sense to you, and then make a plan to find the answer later. Tip number 4 is to take notes. You always want to take notes in hard classes. No one asked you if you wanted to, okay? This is what you gotta do. The harder the class, the more important it is that you take notes. So when you take notes, what you're doing is you're encouraging your brain to play around with the material, to think about it, to rearrange it, to reduce these big concepts that you're listening to from your teacher or reading about and consolidate it into your own language. That process that we put ourselves through from like hearing something and then writing about it or reading something and then writing about it, that does help us understand the material. Also, if you're taking notes, you're less likely to zone out. Right? And we've all zoned out when we were reading or when we were in class with our eyes open. But if you're taking notes, you're actually physically doing something, and that's going to increase the chances that you're going to be able to focus for longer. Number 5, give yourself extra time for assignments. Hard things often just take longer to do. And the sooner you design your days and your weeks around that truth, the better. Don't fight that. If reading a textbook chapter in an easy class takes you, let's say, 40 minutes, then plan 60 minutes to read the same amount of pages in a hard class. Like, plan for it, work it into your schedule. Everything becomes harder when it becomes a surprise, right? If we're constantly being like, oh my gosh, it took me so long to read. Yeah, but it always takes you that long to read. Why are we surprised, right? Build it into your schedule. If doing 10 problems in an easy class takes you 20 minutes, well then give yourself, 35 minutes to do the same amount of problems in a hard class. As soon as you identify that a course is going to be one of those courses for you, one of those hard courses, then start building that type of structure, like the extra time to do things, into your schedule. Because if you don't, then not only is the class hard, and not only is the assignments and things going to take you longer to do, but then you're gonna get so stressed out because you're not gonna have time in your day to like complete all the other things. But if you anticipate that these things are gonna take longer, then you can at least plan for them. I have a really good tutorial for how to use Google Calendar for this exact thing for students, and I'll leave that link in the description box, okay? Tip number 6, start studying earlier than you want to. Now, you might find this advice annoying, but you're here because you want things to be different and you want things to be better, right? So we have to do things differently if we want a different outcome. Now, studying for tests in hard classes takes longer, often because you have to spend some time teaching yourself the material. I mean, if you understood it right when you read about it or right when your teacher taught it, then we wouldn't call it like a hard class, right? Then you wouldn't even be watching this video. So it's kind of a given that if you're studying for a hard class, some of the material didn't sink in or like click the first time that you were exposed to it, like in class or whatever. So yeah, during your study sessions, you're gonna have to spend a little bit of time sort of like teaching yourself the material. And that's why you need to start studying earlier than you want to. Now, for most tests, you're gonna need at least 5 days. Now, obviously, if you're studying for like the medical school exam or the LSAT or something huge, right? You can't do that in 5 days. But I'm talking about like typical high school, college, or graduate school exams. You can typically study for like 5 days minimum. A couple weeks is better. And you should be studying in short, frequent intervals over multiple days. And by short, frequent intervals, I mean study sessions that are around 20-25 minutes up to 45 minutes each study session. Going longer than 45 minutes is going to decrease the amount that you're focusing because we just can't sustain that amount of cognitive effort for that amount of time. So cap it at 45 minutes, but have multiple study sessions. This is called spaced repetition, and yes, I absolutely mention it in like every single video that I make. That's because it's important. And yes, there is a link to my spaced repetition tutorial in the description box. The 7th tip for hard classes is to study in groups. Now, studying in groups is certainly not for everyone, and that's okay. Definitely wasn't for me. I hated group study sessions. But for particularly challenging courses, it can be really helpful to plan at least one group study session before the exam. Now, I always advocate that you need to be studying by yourself first before you have a group study session. Don't start with a group study session because you want to study by yourself so that you get to the point where you're like, okay, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, and then the stuff you don't know, you bring to the group, right? So that you can maximize the amount of time that you have with your group mates. Now, when you study in a group, one of the advantages is that you can hear people your own age, your peers, explaining the concepts in like you guys' language, not like some like professor or some teacher or some textbook. It's like the way you talk. If your peer is like, oh, whatever is this. I can't literally can't even think of an example, but like if they're defining a concept for you that you were struggling with and then they phrase it in a way that's like normal person language, then you're gonna have an easier time understanding it. Does that make sense? Now, during a group study session, you're having conversations about the material. You're going back and forth. There's no just like you being talked at by a professional. It's more of a learning experience, like a multi-directional conversation where you're immersed in what it is that you're learning versus you just sitting in here receiving what's being taught at you. And this helps you process information that you were struggling to process on your own. So if you've hated group study sessions up to this point, I argue, give it a shot. For a really hard class, give it a shot, like a few days before your exam, see if it works. Tip number 8 for hard classes is to get extra help. If you're taking a really hard class and you've really tried on your own, like really tried every single strategy that I've ever taught, okay, and the class is still really hard, then you've got to get extra help. You might not want to, but that's not really what matters here. Can you schedule like a consistent weekly check-in with your teacher, maybe before school or after school? Does your school have a peer tutoring program if you didn't want to stay after with a teacher and you'd prefer a peer? Can you hire a tutor just temporarily to get you through one hard class? I'll bet the answer to at least one of those questions is yes. Now listen, I am the first to be like, oh, just YouTube it and Google it and be resourceful and find it on the internet or whatever. But like, there's some material that's just really hard. And all the YouTube videos in the world aren't gonna match the level of explanation that you will get from a human who can read your face, who can detect whether you understand it, who can answer your questions, right? Sometimes you just need that little bit of extra help to get you over the hump of a hard class. Tip 9 is to ask questions. You don't get answers if you don't ask questions. Now, I know it can feel really weird to just raise your hand in class, but do it anyway. When I used to teach high school in a high school classroom, it was like the best when somebody raised their hand. I didn't even care what you were asking. Seriously, if someone raised their hand, I'm just like, oh my God, ask me all day. Like teachers aren't, unless they're on a roll and they're in the middle of like their delivery, then like read the room, hold your question, right? But if the classroom environment is more of this sort of familial, informal conversation, you better put that hand in the air. The teacher is there to answer your questions, but not if you don't ask them. Does that make sense? And chances are you're sitting there in class being like, oh my gosh, this is so confusing. And you're like, why does everybody get it, but I don't? Look around the room. I bet half the people you see don't get it either. And when you raise your hand and you're like, can you explain that again or whatever? They're like, oh my God, thank gosh they asked that, right? You're not the only one who's confused. So if asking questions during class isn't really your thing, then I have some tips. So here are some types of questions you can ask when you're confused. There's clarification questions. So that would be like, could you please explain that again? Or could you please explain that differently? There's example questions. Could you please give us another example? That's an example of an example question. And then there's repeat questions. Something like, could you please say that again? I missed it the first time. And then there's explanation questions. So something like, could you please explain that a little bit more? So in summary, clarification, example, repeat, and explanation questions. And tip number 10, be resourceful. The further along in school you are, so if you're in graduate school or college, university, then the more you're expected to sort of take the reins on your own and sort of figure things out on your own. What was that? Did you ask if I had a video on how to figure things out? Oh my gosh, I so totally do, and I will leave that link in the description box. Of course, I have a video that's how to figure things out, like how to actually be resourceful. Go watch that. But listen, when you get stuck on something, of course, I just advocated like go ask your teacher and then like stay after and get extra help or whatever. But even before that, you kind of are expected to attempt to figure things out on your own first. No matter what level you're at, high school, college, or graduate school, if you go to your teacher looking for help, they're going to expect that you at least made an effort to figure it out independently first. So instead of going up to a teacher and being like, I don't get it, you want to make sure that your question is specific. What don't you get? Because the better your questions, the better the answers you're going to get. And you won't know what types of questions you have specifically until you sit down and try to figure it out. And you say, okay, where did my comprehension fall apart? At what point did I stop understanding this? And then you bring that to the teacher, right? So here are some examples of being resourceful. Googling what you don't know, watching YouTube videos for content that's confusing, asking your peers for help, and then answering the textbook questions at the end of every chapter, even though they haven't been assigned. All of that is going to help you better understand the material for your hard course. Now, in addition to the 10 tips that I just went over, I have a few additional points to make, okay, about taking hard classes. Now, if you're getting really overwhelmed with all of your courses and suddenly they all seem really hard, then it might be a matter of quantity. In other words, maybe all your classes aren't hard, maybe only like 1 or 2 of them are, but you're taking too many courses, and therefore that's making them all seem hard because there's just not enough time in the day. Do you have to drop a course? I don't know, that's a question you have to ask yourself. Also, if you're doing everything possible, you're following all these 10 tips and you're really still struggling in this hard course, maybe you do need to drop down a level. Or maybe it's a course you can't drop down a level in, you have to take that course, well then where can you back off in other areas? Is there another course that's not required to be at a certain level and you're still taking it at a higher level? Can you take that course down a level so that you have more bandwidth and cognitive resources to spend, and time and energy to spend on the harder course? That's something to think about too. And then also you always want to consider the timing of you taking hard courses. So for example, if you play a fall sport, maybe save your hard class until the spring semester. If you have a spring job or an internship that kicks in the spring, then maybe you take your hard course the first semester. One of the things that can make hard courses seem so much harder, or even courses that weren't even hard to begin with seem harder, is not the course itself, but all of the other things we have going on in our life that consume our time and our energy and our focus, right? We can't just look at school. We can't just look at this one class. You have to look at the big picture, like the picture of you and what your days and your weeks look like. All of that together can make any particular thing seem harder than it really is. All right, so hang in there. Hard courses are meant to be hard. It doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. It just means you probably need to shift strategies, okay? Back off other areas in your life and just like hang on tight. You got it. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you try it and you really take action. It's awesome that you're watching this video. Thank you so much for doing that. But the magic is in the action. Am I right? I'm right. And as always, thank you so much for watching.